Bonjour, welcome, thank you for joining us. Je suis Elizabeth May, co-chef du Parti vert du Canada, et avec moi aussi, co-chef Jonathan Pedneault. Nous sommes ici ce matin pour une conférence de presse au sujet de la potentiel de coopération des progressistes dans les prochaines élections. It's a topic of concern for many Canadians. I've been at the helm of the Green Party, this time co-leader, but leading the party into elections since 2008. And it's always a concern of Canadians that the voting system forces them into what is essentially a fear-based vote. Vote for this person that you don't like very much, hold your nose while you do it because the other person is worse. Canadians believe we were going to be past that. Il y a maintenant presque un décennie, des libéraux ont fait leur compromis de terminer le système de vote que nous avons maintenant, le système de vote uninominal par chaque vote, the first past the post system, notre système actuel que je pense que les Canadiens détestent. We had a promise from the Liberals in the 2015 election. It was repeated thousands of times that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post. What does this have to do with what Canadians face in this election? We all know this is a very significant election where Canada is being tested on many fronts. I am very proud as a Canadian to see how many Canadians are stepping up to say, we are united as a country, we are not cowed or frightened by the threats coming from the White House. This is, and I certainly agree with Prime Minister Trudeau, this is a really dumb thing to do, to start a trade war with your single biggest trading partner. But it goes beyond that. It goes to things, I'm just back from the United Nations where meetings are still taking place. I attended the meetings of the international parliamentarians for the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is taking place this week in New York at the United Nations. Concerns around the world about an increasingly destabilized world, a place where for the first time in decades, leaders actually talk about the possibility of using nuclear weapons, mean that around the world, whether we're talking about the situation in Gaza or the President of the United States expressed interest in territorial expansion, whether it's Greenland or Canada or Panama, have made the global diplomatic world, the community of nations, economic alliances, political and strategic alliances, increasingly worried and unstable. Given that, as Canadians pull together, we're about to go into an election, we're not certain of exactly when, but soon, where that resolve to stand together will be significantly tested as we enter a very toxic playing field of who can run attack ads that malign the intention and character of the other guy, again, to inspire fear-based voting. So as Greens, and I'll turn the floor over very, very soon to Jonathan Pedneault, comme Verts, nous sommes en faveur de les efforts de coopération. Nous avons déjà fait les efforts de commencer les conversations avec les autres partis. We have been in conversation with different levels of insiders within the Liberal Party, the New Democratic Party. We've talked to colleagues in Parliament. What kind of interest would there be in listening to the voices of Canadians, like the grassroots group that has sprung up of Cooperate for Canada, who want to see parties sit down and talk to each other about how we can potentially cooperate across this country and be able to have that common resolve that survives an election, be able to envision a parliament that functions well together, taking on the threats that Canada faces. To do that, we wanted to make this press conference today a public commitment to being willing to talk to other parties, to talk about what it takes in a perverse first-past-the-post voting system to remind Canadians that we don't elect a prime minister in this country. We elect a parliament. There are currently 5 parties in the House of Commons, and if we were to find a way to cooperate, we could ensure at least that neither one of the big parties gets a false majority with 100% of the power with less than 50% of public support. There are many examples in past history of Canada, but the main thing is we won't get cooperation if we don't even sit down to talk about it. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à mon co-chef.
Merci, Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for being here. Last time we had over 50% of participation last time a government was elected with more than 50% of the popular votes in Canada was 1958. And that tells us a little bit about the twisted system that we operate under. La dernière fois qu'un gouvernement a été élu majoritairement avec plus de 50% des voix au Canada, c'était en 1958, puis ça nous dit déjà quelque chose à propos de la nature du système dans lequel on opère présentement. Qu'on regarde 2021, 2019, 2015, 2011, 2008, on a toujours eu des gouvernements qui ont été élus avec moins de 40% des voix exprimées lors des votes. Et dans chacune de ces élections, on était autour de 60-65% des Canadiens qui participaient dans les élections. Since, if we look at 2021, 2020, 2019, 2015, 11, 2008, we've had governments elected by roughly 30 to 40% of those who actually showed up to vote, and they were oftentimes and always less than 70% of all Canadians. And that tells us something about the system that we operate under. The threats that we face right now as a country are on a scale we have not seen since the Second World War. We have south of the border a president that is keen on grabbing Canada and using economic means to force us to our knees and take our resources, our land, destroy our institutions, pit us against one another. And Canadians want us here in Ottawa to work together, to protect Canada, to protect our institutions, to protect democracy. And this is why today we are issuing a challenge to Liberal, NDP, and Bloc to sit down and look at how we can collectively potentially come up with a solution to the twisted first-past-the-post system that the Liberals promised on numerous occasions to reform in 2015, but didn't. Alors qu'on fait face à des menaces absolument invraisemblable de la part du président américain au sud de la frontière, un président qui veut nous annexer, voler nos ressources, voler notre territoire, attaquer nos institutions. Je pense que les Canadiens demandent que les partis progressistes présentement s'assoient entre eux et regardent les manières de vraiment offrir une représentation des idées progressistes, puis très franchement, des seuls partis qui sont prêts à se lever puis à se tenir droit dans leurs bottes face à Donald Trump pour assurer un gouvernement qui sera aussi représentatif que possible de la volonté des électeurs. Et donc, aujourd'hui, on est ici pour offrir cette opportunité. On lance un peu un défi à la face des libéraux, du Bloc, des néo-démocrates, pour leur dire, asseyons-nous ensemble et puis discutons un peu de comment on peut gérer, avoir une élection qui est vraiment représentative des envies, des idées, des aspirations des Canadiens, malgré le système électoral absolument peu démocratique que les libéraux ont promis de réformer en 2015 et qu'ils n'ont malheureusement pas fait. Donc, c'est un défi qu'on leur offre aujourd'hui, qu'on leur lance. It's a challenge that we're issuing to the NDP, the Bloc, and the Liberals, and we're looking forward to see if they will be willing to sit down with us and one another to discuss how we can collectively ensure a strong government in the next parliament that will truly be representative of the will of Canadians.
C'est seulement une autre chose, parce qu'aujourd'hui, il y a aussi un communiqué de presse de Democracy Watch qui aussi exige au Parti canadien au niveau fédéral de travailler ensemble pour mettre sur pied les recommandations de Mme Hogue. C'est possible avant les prochaines élections de le faire, mais seulement avec coopération. So to the list of parties that describe themselves and that generally are seen in the media as progressives, let's just also say it would help for cooperation to have fair elections before the next election if the Conservatives wanted to sit down with all the other parties as well and renounce smear-based attack ads, renounce the use of negative algorithms to motivate people into fear-based voting and rage farming-based voting based on misinformation. As Madam Justice Hogue said, the single biggest threat to Canadian democracy comes from disinformation on social media. That's something in the hands of every party to decide they could renounce. So while it's generally seen, and I think it's a common wisdom, that if we're going to see a parliament that cooperates well together, it will be a minority parliament. And it will be a minority parliament where Liberals, Greens, NDP, and Bloc have the majority of the seats, but not any one party able to form a majority government. That will instill in our parliament a spirit of cooperation. That means thinking about voting very differently and thinking about how we might cooperate together. But I don't rule out that we could make a lot of progress for fairer elections if the Conservatives were willing to sit down and talk about it as well. But with that, I'll stop when nous sommes disponibles pour les questions.
Can you be specific about what exactly you're going to the other parties looking for? About, is it, for them to, not run candidates in seats that you already have, the 2 seats that you already have, or is it, what exactly is it that you want from them?
Thanks, Mark. The first thing about it, of course, is to have a conversation. The range of options is almost infinite. Things that have been done in the past. In January 2019, when Jagmeet Singh didn't have a seat and wanted to run in Burnaby South, we did internal polling and we knew that a strong Green candidate might deprive Jagmeet Singh of that seat. I'd been arrested less than a year before fighting the Kinder Morgan pipeline in that very riding, and we offered a leader's courtesy agreement. We didn't put a candidate forward in order to ensure or help that a party that's an important part of the Canadian political fabric have its leader in the House. We didn't ask for anything in return. But those kinds of arrangements are historically appropriate. On the other hand, in a general election, there are many Elections Canada rules about cooperation that borders on collusion that might look like one party was a stalking horse for another. You can't do that. On the other hand, let me give you one specific example, and we could talk about it riding by riding. We have approached senior levels of the New Democratic Party. We have approached senior levels of the Liberal Party. Responses have not been enthusiastic to sitting down and figuring this out. I'm going to give you one example. I went back and double-checked my dates and it's such an obscure example. I wouldn't imagine that very many Canadians would even know this ever happened. But in the 2000 election, the Progressive Conservative leader held the seat of King's Hants in Nova Scotia. That was Joe Clark. He had returned after the annihilation of the Progressive Conservative Party in the 1993 election when it was down to Jean Charest and Elsie Wayne. Anyway, Joe Clark was convinced to come back as leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, won a seat in King's Hants in a by-election, and in the general election in 2000, presented himself to be an MP from his home province. He was running in Calgary. His big opposition was the Reform Party. It was dodgy whether Joe Clark could win in Calgary Centre. Meanwhile, in the 1993 general election, the Liberals won one beachhead seat in Edmonton. Anne McClellan, in 1993, had won by 13 votes. She was nicknamed Landslide Annie. In 2000, in a little-known cooperation effort, every Liberal volunteer in Calgary Centre worked for Joe Clark, and every Progressive Conservative volunteer in Edmonton West worked to elect Anne McClellan. Anne McClellan was elected returning as a Liberal MP and joined Jean Chrétien's cabinet virtually immediately. Joe Clark won his Calgary seat to lead the Progressive Conservatives in Parliament again. Now, without that cooperation, I don't think either one of them, it's plausible. I mean, who knows? Elections are elections, and you can't predict, and you can't, even in hindsight, say what would have happened. But Anne McClellan had won by 13 votes, let's be clear, 7 years earlier. Joe Clark had, as you know, a native son of High River, Alberta, but the Progressive Conservative Party ultimately annihilated, destroyed physically from the ground up by the cannibalization of Progressive Conservatives by reform. Joe Clark winning in Calgary Centre wasn't a foregone conclusion. So just to say, you don't necessarily pull a candidate out of a race. There's always the accusation lurking of backroom deals that are anti-democratic. Any of us who present ourselves for office know that it's complicated. Voters want to know they have their choices. Within the Green Party, we want to run a full slate, and we will, so that every Canadian has the option of voting Green. On the other hand, we want to make sure, to the extent we can, that the door is open, the olive branch is there. Let's talk about it. The NDP candidate in my riding has already been attacking me and saying that I'm too old or shouldn't be reelected because I'm not paying enough attention to my own riding. That's not true. It doesn't matter. The point is, those things happen in election campaigns. Could we find a different path of at least not spreading lies about each other? That'd be good for a start at cooperation. Anyway, Mark, there's lots of different opportunities. There's lots of different ways that Canadians would like to see us cooperate. But the first step is to agree to sit down and talk.
Yeah, maybe just to add, and thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, I mean, clearly, Mark, these are things that we would need to sit down and discuss. But one thing is clear: we're seeing right now the unraveling of U.S. democracy just south of the border. And the answer to that, for me, and I think for a lot of Canadians, for Elizabeth, for Greens throughout the country and progressives, the answer to that is not less democracy, it's more democracy. We have to be able to show here in Canada that Canadians, despite coming from different backgrounds and having slightly different ideas about potentially how we are to face the future together, that we can sit down, compromise, work together. The answer to the situation that we're faced with south of the border right now is not to simply send the majority government to Ottawa that's going to take decisions on behalf of 40 million Canadians with only the backing, if history serves, with only the backing of roughly 40% of the people that actually vote, which are often less than 70% of us. So clearly, if we want to have a government that will both have the mandate and the legitimacy to face the Trump threat, we need to look at places like Germany, places like Scandinavia, where parties actually sit down, work together, have a more representative government, engage in compromise, and really, put their egos aside, put the interests of their parties aside to really focus on the needs of Canadians. And that is what we're challenging the other parties to do right now, because we're absolutely ready to do that if they are willing to engage with us.
You said senior New Democrats and senior Liberals were not enthusiastic when you approached them. What reasons did they give for that?
Well, I don't know that we could say there were actual reasons. It was just, certainly from the New Democratic Party, they just said no. No. There's more interest, I think, but we don't know who the next Liberal leader will be. I think there may be interest to at least talk, but I can't say that it was, there was no sense of, yes, let's for sure move forward. I continue to be concerned as we get closer and closer to an election. This is a slight deviation from answering your question properly. I apologize. But I really am astonished that while the Conservatives are demanding that Mark Carney disclose all business and also non-government organization connections, I don't hear an equal demand that Pierre Poilievre ensure that Canadians know he's not compromised by foreign interference, and he can only do that by seeking top-secret security clearance. That's important. He should do it. Madam Justice Hogue made the point in her report that whoever becomes the next Liberal leader should engage in that process. May I say? Yes, Jonathan Pedneault has also started that process of asking how we go about having both co-leaders of the Green Party, because I have top secret security clearance, and now that Jonathan is co-leader, he's pursuing that. Why is Mr. Poilievre refusing to even ask to be reviewed to see if he's compromised in any way whatsoever by foreign interference? He should do that, get it out of the way, so that during an election campaign, by the way, we do now have systems in place that we didn't used to have to exchange information, and from security and foreign interference perspective, activity that is suspicious will get flagged and reported to parties. We all have liaisons with the security teams and the foreign interference watchdogs to know if we see a problem. How we respond to it quickly, we don't know. If it's out there, it's out there. Elon Musk has actively and recently engaged in promoting the most far right of what are essentially neo-Nazis in Germany on the eve of their elections. This is outrageous foreign interference, and yet we, I think, wouldn't have any trouble imagining that it can happen in Canada. And how do we collectively, as political leaders across the spectrum, denounce that, call it out, and make sure Canadians aren't drawn into believing something that is absolutely not the case because it's presented by what look like reliable news sources. We've seen this happen before. That's why the CRTC, which made a terrible mistake in ever giving Russia Today a license to operate on cable networks in Canada. They finally withdrew that after Putin invaded Ukraine. But I've seen, and I've talked to constituents. I mean, I spend a lot of time just listening to my constituents. And when they tell me they actually believe some of the stuff that their news source is Russia Today, I think, oh, okay. We could cooperate far more across party lines and with the institutions we have in this country to make sure that we protect Canadians from disinformation, and that wherever we can, as we're saying, we're open to talking to the party leadership, party backroom campaign managers, riding by riding if necessary. What do we do to deliver to Canadians a parliament that better represents what Canadians want from their democracy?
But the key here is to understand that we've tried this, right? We've taken steps to discuss these issues with Liberals and New Democrats alike. The response has been no, and quite frankly, now we're making this public approach because the times call for it. The times and Canadians are asking us to collaborate with one another. It is critical that we answer the authoritarian drive of Donald Trump with more democracy, not less. And so, you know, as to their reasons, I mean, Mark, I think you'll be you'll be able to ask them directly. But for us, it is clear that if they are open to sitting down and discussing how we approach the next election together, we will absolutely do so in good faith, and hopefully find a solution that we can communicate publicly to Canadians ahead of the the next election. Yeah. Any more questions?
I'm just curious, what I guess leverage do you think you have just having 2 seats in Parliament, especially now as opposed to 2 months ago? Like, the Liberals are now very competitive again. They could even be looking at a majority government if you believe recent polls. The Bloc's doing well in Quebec. The NDP just spent, you know, a few years with significant power in a minority parliament. So why do you think they would be open, you know, when the current system could work fine for them? It's you who, you know.
Yeah, but it doesn't work well for Canadians, right? Clearly, Canadians are showing they're showing growing disinterest and growing mistrust towards our institutions right now. And part of the reason for that is that roughly 60% of us, when we go out to vote, our votes don't count for anything. There are hundreds of thousands of Canadians that vote Green throughout the country. and that results in only 2 seats. You're quite right to point it out, Mark, but that is the result, the direct result of the distortions created by the first-past-the-post system that Trudeau promised over and over again to reform and did not, because it's a winner-take-all system that serves him and serves his party but doesn't serve Canada. Now we're in this situation of great stress for our democracy and for our national sovereignty. I think it is crucial that we explore all options to try and balance the system that we are forced to work with because the Liberals let us down. No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. You good? No more questions? All right. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine.